Quite possibly one of the greatest myths about the Israel-Palestine conflict is that it's been happening for a very long time and is all about ancient religious hatreds. In fact, while religion is involved, the conflicts mostly revolve around two groups who claim the same land. It really only goes back about a century to the early 1900s. Around that time, the region along the eastern Mediterranean, now called Israel-Palestine, was under Ottoman rule for centuries and was religiously diverse, with mostly Muslims and Christians, and a small number of Jews who lived in relative peace. However, two significant changes were happening. First, more people in the region were developing a sense of being not just ethnic Arabs but Palestinians with a distinct national identity. At the same time, not far away in Europe, more Jews were joining a movement called Zionism. This movement asserted that Judaism was not just a religion but also an identity, one that deserved its own nation. After centuries of persecution, many believed that a Jewish state was their best hope for safety and saw their historic homeland in the Middle East as their best chance for establishing it. In the first decades of the 20th century, tens of thousands of European Jews moved there after World War I. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and the British and French empires carved up the Middle East, the British took control of a region called the British Mandate for Palestine. Initially, the British allowed Jewish emigration, but as more Jews arrived and settled into farming communities, tensions between Jews and Arabs grew, leading to acts of violence. By the 1930s, the British began limiting Jewish emigration, and in response, Jewish militias formed to fight both the local Arabs and to resist British rule. Then came the Holocaust, which drove even more Jews to flee Europe for British Palestine and garnered worldwide support for a Jewish state. In 1947, as sectarian violence between Jews and Arabs escalated, the United Nations approved a plan to divide British Palestine into two separate states, one for Jews, Israel, and one for Arabs, Palestine. The city of Jerusalem, with holy sites sacred to Jews, Muslims, and Christians, was to become a special international zone. This plan aimed to give Jews a state, establish Palestinian independence, and end the sectarian violence that the British could no longer control. The Jews accepted the plan and declared independence as Israel. However, Arabs throughout the region saw the UN plan as another attempt at European colonialism trying to take their land. Many Arab states, which had recently won their own independence, declared war on Israel in an effort to establish a unified Arab Palestine in the entirety of British Palestine. The new state of Israel won the war but expanded beyond the borders outlined in the UN plan, taking the western half of Jerusalem and much of the land intended for Palestine. They also expelled a significant number of Palestinians from their homes, creating a massive refugee population whose descendants now number around 7 million. At the end of the war, Israel controlled all the territory except for Gaza, which Egypt controlled, and the West Bank, named for its location west of the Jordan River, which Jordan controlled. This marked the beginning of the decades-long Arab-Israeli conflict. In 1978, Israel and Egypt signed the US-brokered Camp David Accords. Shortly after, Israel gave back the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt as part of the peace treaty. While this was highly controversial in the Arab world and even led to the assassination of Egyptian President Anwar Sadat in part due to outrage, it marked the beginning of the end of the broader Arab-Israeli conflict. Over the next few decades, other Arab states gradually made peace with Israel, even if they never signed formal peace treaties. However, Israel's military still occupied the Palestinian territories of the West Bank and Gaza, and this is when the conflict evolved into an Israeli-Palestinian struggle. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, formed in the 1960s to seek a Palestinian state, fought against Israel, including through acts of terrorism. Initially, the PLO claimed all of what had been British Palestine, aiming to end the state of Israel completely. Fighting between Israel and the PLO went on for years, including a 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon. The ceasefire in southern Lebanon was shattered by the sound of guns, bombs, and planes. Later, the PLO indicated its willingness to accept a division of the land between Israel and Palestine, but the conflict continued. During all these events, something significant was changing in the Israeli-occupied Palestinian territories. Israeli settlers were moving in. These settlers made their homes in the West Bank and Gaza for various reasons, including religious, ideological, and economic ones. Some settlements were cities with thousands of people, while others were small communities deep into the West Bank. These settlers were accompanied by soldiers to guard them. The growing settlements forced Palestinians off their land and divided communities. In the short term, they made the occupation more painful for Palestinians, and in the long term, by dividing up Palestinian land, they made it much more difficult for Palestinians to ever have an independent state. Today, there are several 100,000 settlers in the occupied territory, even though the international community considers them illegal. By the late 1980s, Palestinian frustration erupted into the Intifada, an Arabic word for uprising. It began with mostly protests and boycotts but soon escalated to violence. Israel responded with heavy force, resulting in casualties on both sides. As this was happening, a group of Palestinians in Gaza, considering the PLO too moderate, created Hamas, a violent extremist group dedicated to Israel's destruction. By the early 1990s, it became clear that Israelis and Palestinians needed to make peace. Leaders from both sides signed the Oslo Accords, which were meant to be the significant first step toward Israel withdrawing from the Palestinian territories and allowing an independent Palestine. The Oslo Accords established the Palestinian Authority, granting Palestinians a bit of freedom to govern themselves in certain areas. However, hardliners on both sides opposed the Oslo Accords, leading to acts of violence. Members of Hamas launched suicide bombings to sabotage the process, while the Israeli right protested peace talks, with some calling Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin a traitor and a Nazi. Not long after Rabin signed the second round of Oslo Accords, he was assassinated by an extreme right Israeli, highlighting how extremists on both sides could use violence to derail peace and perpetuate the conflict as they sought the other side's total destruction. This dynamic has persisted since then. Negotiations meant to hammer out the final details of peace dragged on for years, and a major Camp David summit in 2000 came up empty. Palestinians began to believe that peace wasn't forthcoming and rose in a second intifada, one much more violent than the first. By the time it wound down a few years later, about 1,000 Israelis and 3,200 Palestinians had died. The second intifada significantly changed the conflict. Israelis became much more skeptical that Palestinians would ever accept peace or that it was even worth pursuing.